So is Donald Trump pushing the United States towards civil war? This is a question that we've now been asking for like 10 years now. In fact, 8 years ago on this very YouTube channel, I did a 2-video sort of mini-series talking about exactly this question. Is Donald Trump making things so much worse? Have we become so much more divided as a country that we're falling back towards historical eras of division? I made that series 8 years ago, and that means that we've got another installment in the Rob versus Rob series, which people seem to enjoy. And I think which people will enjoy a bit more is I kind of disagree with myself this time around on a number of levels. Back in 2017, I was super dismissive of the idea that we were falling into civil war, or that what we were going through today was somehow, anywhere near as bad as a number of historical eras that we're about to get to. I really was sort of very, very, very dismissive. I still don't believe that we're falling into civil war, so I disagree with myself on a couple fronts. I do think we have a real problem here in the United States now that we are, I guess, 10 years into the Donald Trump era. Like, things are rotting, like from the head, from the bottom. We have serious, serious problems. I disagree with myself on that, but I also disagree with the way that I framed the problem in these 2017 videos. I think I fell into sort of the general mainstream approach to these problems that Donald Trump symbolizes and whatnot, which is this idea of polarization, this idea that what we need to worry about is falling to a place where we hate each other just as much as we hated each other during the Civil War or the 1960s or the 1990s or other periods. But I don't think that's actually the problem. I don't think the problem is polarization. The problem is consensus. Specifically, the problem is elite consensus. I think the problem we have, which is a lot deeper than I thought it was back in 2017. It's become a much deeper problem, actually, with what's been happening with markets and tech companies and whatnot. But it's a problem of elite consensus. It's elite consensus around Reaganite ideas of pro-business and pro-war fundamentalism. And in fact, we could stand to have a lot more discussion and a lot more disagreement on these basic issues. One of the reasons why we're falling so hard right now, one of the reasons why the Democrats are such failures in opposing Donald Trump is because they agree with him on like 90% of everything. I'm talking about Democratic leadership here, agrees with him on pro-war fundamentalism, agrees with him on pro-business fundamentalism. So how can they oppose Trump? We're getting into this real problem, not of red versus blue or North versus South or us versus them. It's a real problem of the ossified elite versus the rest of us. And that's not that, you can definitely turn that into a civil war problem, but it's a different kind of problem from the other eras that we've been in. And actually, it's a much easier problem to solve. If we look back to some of the lessons of the 1930s. And in fact, I don't believe that here in the 2020s, we're in as much trouble as we were in the array of historical eras that we're about to talk to in this video. So let's get into it. And my very luxurious haircut from 2017.
Hey there. Lately, a very troubling idea has been floating around. Is the United States heading for a new civil war? No, it is not. These articles are mostly half-baked clickbait. I, of course, would never cover a controversial topic just because I thought it would get more views. My hypocrisy aside, I think it's worth addressing the idea that the United States is now somehow in unprecedented danger. It's not.
So the United States absolutely is in danger. It is mind-blowing to me that Donald Trump got elected as president again. And if you had told me that in 2017, in this video, I was correct that Trump was going to lose. in 2020, but if you told me that then he would come back in 2024, I certainly didn't have a ton of respect for Democrats back then, but the idea that they could fumble the ball as massively as they did. And I think one dynamic here is that if Donald Trump was what he should have been, which was like an incredible shock to the system where everybody realizes that pro-war fundamentalism and pro-business fundamentalism are a really, really bad idea, if that had actually happened, then we'd be in a much, much better place today as a country. Unfortunately, that is not what happened. We got stasis. We got a elite consensus across the Republican and Democratic parties that got together to change nothing. That's what Joe Biden is. It was a change nothing candidate. Sure, there was like a little bit, to get Bernie and AOC on side, there was like a little bit of knob turning at the margins, Lena Khan and FTC, not 100% endorsing the insane fraud that is cryptocurrency, just minor things. But fundamentally, Joe Biden was a consensus pick to avoid doing anything about pro-war fundamentalism or pro-business fundamentalism. And that got us Donald Trump again. So we're not talking about a 4-year disastrous aberration. We're talking about an entire, at least 12-year Trump era. And Biden is just very much going to be remembered as just a part of the Trump era. We're in real trouble. This is an extended period of time of, I keep going to biological metaphors of rot, of an infection that is not being dealt with. It is instead, we're doing everything we can to stop treating this infection. There's got to be a great Robert F. Kennedy analogy to bring in here, but I'm not. This is not a heavily produced video, so imagine I made that reference.
There are many problems. The internet has been doing some very weird things to our economy and our politics. Anybody with a smartphone can impact the national conversation. I am obviously a big fan of this, but there are downsides. It's given us a president who is an idiot and a blowhard. Most disturbingly, the rise of the alt-right has turned the country's racist subtext into text. It's shocking to be dealing with proud white supremacists in 2017, and I don't want to minimize that.
It's interesting looking back at myself in 2017. I was already very shaken by the 2016 election. I was a pro-business fundamentalist up until the 2016 election, and it took me a number of years thereafter to sort of figure that out. I was still very much in big tech's got downsides and pluses, pluses and minuses, ups and downs. And honestly, in 2017, I think that was a defensible position. I do find it interesting that this clip here connects big tech and white supremacy. There's definitely been a lot of that interaction over the past 8 years. Specifically, that pretty obvious white supremacists like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel are the biggest avatars of big tech, and even less flagrantly racist figures are sort of leaning that way more and more because they recognize that leaning into this white supremacy is a good way to defend the status quo of pro-business fundamentalism, which is key to the leadership and funding of both the Republican and Democratic parties. So yeah, I'm pretty anti-big tech now. And of course, this is the big tech of 2025, not the big tech of 2017. There were further seeing people back in 2017 who could see where big tech was trending. It took me longer to recognize that. But no, it's a real problem. And I am not someone who believes that, it's the internet's fault. The internet is the real problem. No, it's not the internet. It is the fact that we chose to turn the internet, a government creation, over to a bunch of very selfish people who figured out how to monetize advertising. And this has worked in a couple ways. It has made the internet much, 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 much worse, far worse than I could have imagined in 2017. But it's also created very, very large centers of power that are working to perpetuate pro-business and pro-war fundamentalism. And they're working more and more closely together. If you examine Palantir, New Deals, with the Defense Department, from Amazon, Microsoft, the whole range of the big tech companies.
But we're nowhere near where we were in the run-up to the U.S. Civil War. In fact, I can think of a number of historical periods since then when we were in a lot worse shape than we are today. We've got problems, but we can handle them. We've handled them before. When it comes to the possibility of armed insurrection, I'd argue that things were actually worse in the early 1990s. Anybody remember the Michigan militia? After a botched arrest at Ruby Ridge in 1992 and the government massacre of a religious cult in Waco in 1993, the armed militia movement exploded across the country. Thousands, some say tens of thousands of people formed armed groups who talked enthusiastically about fighting the federal government. I'd say that's a good deal more intimidating than a bunch of losers retweeting frog memes, wouldn't you? In April of 1995, a man affiliated with the militia movement blew up a federal building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people. After that, the militia movement pretty much evaporated. Remnants still exist today, but it was pretty much over as a mass phenomenon. It's too early to tell, but I think the death of Heather Heyer in Charlottesville earlier this month might be having a similar effect on the alt-right. Ironic racism just isn't that cute and funny anymore.
You know, it's interesting. I still think the 1990s were worse. I was right. Things did die down on the sort of right-wing violence, organized violence spectrum after Charlottesville. I think, before you bite my head off, we're actually seeing another spike of that. But it's of a different character. There's, of course, that famous example where the FBI got a whole bunch of people together to try and kidnap Governor Whitmer. But other than a Democratic Michigan governor, but other than that, there's not really much organized right-wing violence. January 6th, certainly there were organized elements getting people together there, but it's mostly just a bunch of dumb yahoos. What we do have a horrific problem with is the violence of unorganized lone wolf psychopaths who manage to radicalize themselves by going on the internet and deciding they have an affinity with some insanity, or if they're just irony pilled. I'm not sure what the appropriate terminology is. This is actually another aspect of our pro-war fundamentalism. You'll have a lot of people in the right wing who would be like, yeah, of course, you're totally right that the FBI was created that plot against Governor Whitmer to entrap some fine white American citizens. What they will not agree with, neither Republicans nor Democrats will agree with, that most of what the FBI has been doing since 9/11 is concocting plots around usually very uneducated, sometimes learning disabled Muslim immigrants. That's most of what sort of the FBI does. But we've got this framework in our pro-war, pro-business, pro-war business fundamentalist media that when the FBI says something is real and is a real threat, we have to listen to it and respect it. And it's generally nonsense. We have a horrific problem with lone wolf violence in the United States. I am becoming more of a questioner of the Second Amendment. I haven't really thought all of that through. But that is, of course, just a big part of elite consensus that, the Democrats like to talk about gun violence and not do anything about it. And the Republicans are very happy to have guns for everybody all the time. So yeah, it's just it's not anywhere near as bad as it was in the 1990s.
So I think I left a really important detail on the table here, important distinction. Over the Biden administration, the course of the Biden administration, there was certainly a little bit of grassroots growth of right-wing ideology or even right-wing extremism, anti-vax, all kinds of resentment of
COVID stuff in general. That's definitely a dynamic that I don't want to minimize. What I do want to minimize is the idea that there's some large-scale right-wing insurgent threat that we need to be worried about at the grassroots level. At the elite level, there was absolutely a growing and massive, I don't even really want to call it right-wing, I want to call it a sort of unified push towards Donald Trump. It was the elite rallying behind Donald Trump in the name of traditionally right-wing coded ideology around tax cuts. Fundamentally, even with the tiny changes that Joe Biden was making, folks in Silicon Valley got incredibly alarmed. This is beyond Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Mark Andreessen, the openly vocal right-wing filth. I'm talking about just more broadly, and not just Silicon Valley. Wealthy people, the elite of this country, the upper echelons of this country, the people who own media organizations, that was the true terrifying shift. A bunch of folks who decided, well, Donald Trump was chaotic and crazy, but it's more important to us to maintain our, 5 to 10% more cheaper taxes, cheaper tax cuts. It's more important to us to buy a private island than to buy another private island than to preserve the American Republic. That is a true terrifying shift in politics that is incredibly dangerous. That is like the main problem. And it is not a right-wing insurgency based around racism or economic insecurity or this, that, and the other thing. It is the completely unjustified economic insecurity that our oligarchs felt at the mere suggestion that maybe some of Donald Trump's tax cuts might have been reversed. Maybe some of the unquestioning deference to Silicon Valley and financial power in our system that we've become accustomed to in the Reagan era of the past 50 years, maybe some of that would be dialed back just a notch. And all our oligarchs became incredibly alarmed and piled in behind Donald Trump. That's the real right-wing insurgency of the Biden years that changed the 2024 election. It had nothing to do, or very little to do, with any kind of grassroots movement.
In the 1990s, part of the thing that made that organized militia movement so threatening is that those guys had all fought in a much more serious war than the war on terror. War on terror, a lot of respect for people who served, this, that, and the other thing, but that was nothing compared to Vietnam. There's some figures coming on later in this video to talk about that. There are more people dying, more U.S. soldiers dying in Vietnam every year than died in the entire war on terror, more or less. So it was a much more serious war with a whole bunch of guys who came back from that very damaged. And in the 1990s, these men were still my age. They were in their late 30s, 40s into their early 50s and could still sort of pick up guns. It's an interesting factor in the sort of the march of time. The global war on terror radicalized people who would plausibly get into a militia are already kind of aging out. The surge was 2011, 2012, so that's coming up on 15 years ago. And again, this is a much, much smaller group of people than the population of Americans that went and fought in Vietnam. So I honestly think in terms of like organized right-wing violence, the 1990s was a lot more dangerous than the 2020s. The problem is elite consensus in favor of pro-war, pro-business fundamentalism. That is what is destroying this country and putting us in a real place of danger. It's not really about polarization. The problem of the 2020s is not out of control right-wing militias. The problem is out of control government agencies. And I'm somebody who loves government regulation now. I'm pro-government stuff. I am not pro out of control government Gestapos. And what we've got right now under Trump, but before Trump as well, Trump has just accelerated this, we've got the Gestapos are getting more and more rights, more and more powers, more and more monies. I'm talking about the galaxy of agencies that probably should exist, that exist under the Department of Homeland Security, but should not be under the Department of Homeland Security. They should be under the Department of Justice. They should be constrained by laws, not led by folks like Tom Homan, who take bribes and are just flatulent, gross individuals. They should be under people who actually care about the rule of law. And then we're cutting all the useful parts of government. And we've been doing this for quite some time, but Trump, like everything else, is just an acceleration, as he is with everything else, is an acceleration of this pro-war fundamentalism, pro-business fundamentalism. We're going to build as much Gestapo as we can, as much secret police, as much security forces as we can, and we're going to let the market handle everything else. That's the real problem right now. And most Democrats agree with the Republicans that this is like the right thing to do. Shocking numbers of the Democrat resistance figures that we're supposed to celebrate are all like CIA veterans or like military types, and consider that to be a selling point. That's the problem of the 2020s, is a out of control security forces, not polarization.
Some claim that we're going to get a civil war over inequality. Globalization and the internet mean that the rich have been doing very, very well, while the rest of the country hasn't made much economic progress over the past few decades. This is a real problem, but I've got a question for you. Have you ever gone to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City? 100 years ago, the contents of this museum and dozens of other museums across the country sat in the many mansions of our plutocrats. America's millionaires truly lived like kings. At the same time, much of the country lived like this. We've had extremes of wealth and poverty before, and they were much, much worse at the turn of the last century. Sorting that era out occasionally involved open warfare between capitalists and workers. A consensus seems to be building that something needs to be done about income inequality. And nobody had to die in a strike to get us there.
Wow, was I wrong about that? Probably one of the biggest shifts between Rob of 2017 and Rob of 2025 is that I really, really care about inequality. It's just become clear on issue after issue how distorting these pools of insane, massive wealth are that we've built up everywhere. The way that it has just absolutely warped U.S. politics just becomes more and more obvious. Just sort of an off-the-wall example that I like to talk about is oil companies, right? Like oil companies have these big, big pools of wealth. And we've actually sort of solved climate change in like the 1950s. All we needed was nuclear plants. And the general thought mind, what people generally think is oh man, it's a shame that we didn't build more nuclear plants. And I'm so angry at those dirty hippies at the Sierra Club and Greenpeace that that made it so that we don't have nuclear plants. And it's how blind do you have to be? Do you think dirty hippies at Greenpeace and the Sierra Club know people in the clubs, the private clubs, the alumni networks that run all of the news agencies that killed nuclear power in the United States? It wasn't the hippies. Sure, the hippies were a fun rationale, but it was the oil companies. It was the concentrations of wealth in the oil companies that killed the nuclear industry that are the reason that we're still facing a climate change issue that was solved back in the 1950s. And that's just one example, but that is over and over and over. I mean, the entire cryptocurrency industry is a great example of this. It was still kind of a joke back in 2017. 2017 was actually, I think, 2017 and then 2020, 2021. It was sort of a peak before the 2021 peak, and now we're in another peak because, of course, the crypto frauds are now running the table in Washington, D.C. But that's we see that everywhere. We see that with tech. We see that with AI. I've always been someone who was very skeptical from a libertarian angle of campaign finance reform and worrying about great wealth and whatnot. I'm still kind of skeptical of campaign finance reform. I'd lean more towards antitrust and breaking up some of these big companies. You don't need to, you're not going to be able to stop people at like the point of actually paying politicians. What you need to do is break up the big pools of capital, is sort of where I'm leaning now, which is very different from where I was in 2017. So sort of, minimizing the Gilded Age. In fact, actually, I was talking about like, oh, look at all these big, beautiful museums that the wealthy people of the Gilded Age in the 1890s built up. And they are beautiful and they're massive. And I've come to realize that, in fact, actually, it's just that our rich people today are tackier and don't have any kind of appreciation for art and don't have any kind of urge to set up civic organizations that do anything other than fund their pro-business fundamentalism in the Republican and Democratic parties. Like the Gilded Age robber barons were not great people, but at least they built things of worth. The rich people we've got today are just folks who've just repurposed government-provided wealth in different ways, and are keeping all of it to themselves. I think there's data out there that says that these folks are a lot richer comparatively than the robber barons of the 1890s were. I would say that 2017 Rob was completely wrong about the Gilded Age, and things are actually in a lot of ways worse now. Not in like, human development indicators or whatnot, but just like we're in a similar like place in political economy that's arguably kind of worse, because at least back then, like you could see like a grassroots of reformers that were going to change it. And I'm not seeing a ton of that this time around. It's just sort of pro-war and pro-business fundamentalism, all the way down.
And to go all the way back to 1861, the year the real U.S. Civil War actually started, there's a basic element missing if we were going to go down the same path. There were dissidents in the North and South, but most of them were on board with their sectional interests. We love talking about red states and blue states today as if everybody in California was a Democrat and everybody in Texas was a Republican. That's just not true. 31% of California, the home of Nixon and Reagan, voted for Donald Trump in 2016. And Texas actually increased its Democratic percentage in 2016 for Hillary Clinton, the second most hated presidential candidate in U.S. history. I'm beginning to suspect that Trump will lose in 2020, actually, not because the Democrats will get their acts together, but because Texas will go blue. But that's a different video.
Texas turning blue. Okay, that one was just embarrassing. And that was sort of standard speculation. I think Texas has always been about to turn blue. I was right in 2017 about the Democrats winning in 2020 without actually fixing anything about the Democratic Party. So I got that one right anyway. Texas did not turn blue. I think the Democrats could win Texas and like a whole bunch of other states if they offered something other than like a kinder, more legalistic version of the same pro-war, pro-business fundamentalism that Donald Trump is selling. But, we'll see if that happens.
When people imagine a new civil war, they probably aren't thinking of armies in blue and gray marching. They're probably thinking of something darker and a good deal more messy. They're thinking of the kinds of disruptions we saw in the 1960s, but more intense and larger. It may be fading a bit now, but throughout my life, the 1960s have been a dominant part of U.S. mythology. It's a baby boomer epic of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It features strife and suffering, the evils of Nixon in Vietnam, and the redemption of greater rights for African Americans and the success of other liberation movements. Elements of this mythology are very true, but the actual history has been forgotten. Our panic pundits imagine that we're in a similar time of strife and struggle today. That's where a lot of this Civil War talk comes from. It's nuts. The 1960s were a lot worse than we remember, and we are in nowhere near that much trouble today.
So we're in pretty big trouble here in the United States, and I've come to believe that the 1960s is a less useful analogy. In the 1960s, I think it was more about problems of polarization. I mean, a lot of our elites back then were the New Deal types who had actually created decades of much more equal U.S. prosperity, the eras of greatest U.S. success, whereas our elites now are honestly just a bunch of terrifyingly ineffective greed heads. So it's a different issue, but I think it's still worth looking into the 1960s and understanding the ways that it was in many ways worse than what we have now, but the problems were different.
The confusion starts with the fact that when we talk about the 1960s, we're not actually talking about the years between 1960 and 1970. The civil rights movement expands far back into the 1950s, and the anti-war movement extends into the 1970s. Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court's landmark decision against school segregation, and President Richard Nixon's resignation form decent bookends to the era. We remember some of the horrors of the 1960s, but the larger ones have been forgotten. I began this video with "Four Dead in Ohio," a song by Neil Young about the Kent State Massacre. 4 white kids were killed by National Guardsmen at a protest gone wrong at a university campus in Ohio. When I talk to older friends and family about how much more violent the 1960s were than today, this is the main event that they remember. Kent State was horrible, and I don't want to minimize it, but it's not that hard to imagine it happening today. We were one jammed gun away from the same body count in Charlottesville earlier this month. The 1960s were so much worse than Kent State. Your urban real estate agent can tell you about it. Neighborhoods in multiple American cities burnt down. We're not talking about the broken windows and spilled trash cans of an Antifa protest. We're talking about entire city blocks being destroyed.
So I'd imagine this hits a little bit differently in 2025 than it did in 2017. This 2017 video was obviously made before 2020. Donald Trump was a uniquely effective motivator of protest against himself. There are very few examples in all of U.S. history that you can point to of true nationwide uprisings. And Donald Trump created 2. The Women's March, it's just started Women's March, which was happening every year, starting in 2017. I will always remember being in downtown San Diego in 2017 and just watching this hordes of people in downtown San Diego and all over the country. Black Lives Matter was similar, huge, massive motivations. And yes, it was against Donald Trump personally, but I think the fact that Trump is able to motivate this, it's not just against Donald Trump, it's against Ronald Reagan. It is against the whole legacy of the past 50 years of pro-war and pro-business fundamentalism. People are angry at Trump, yes, but people are angry at a whole heck of a lot more than that. So do I think that the protests or riots of 2020 were somehow worse than the 1960s? Absolutely not. I think that perhaps more right-leaning people might get that impression that 2020 was kind of crazy. It was kind of crazy, but that it was worse than the 1960s, absolutely not. And I think any honest viewing of what comes from here will make that pretty clear. There absolutely were in a few cities. Was there a single block that burned down or something like that? But it is really, really nothing compared to the destruction and the body count of the 1960s. Just as one example, in the 1960s riots ended up, in addition to a range of other factors, completely changing the political economy of the United States. Essentially, there were other factors in this, but essentially destroying the country's inner cities for decades. 5 years after 2020, these incredibly crazy, just violent, evil riots, according to Fox News, urban real estate in the United States continues its sort of hockey stick trajectory. They remain the most desirable and expensive places to live. That's just one example among many that are expressed in this clip coming up.
Los Angeles, Detroit, Washington, D.C., Chicago, and as many as 100 other cities had serious riots. Many of these cities experienced massive property destruction, and some riots featured dozens of deaths. According to one historian, Newark, New Jersey was particularly horrific, featuring gangs of cops running around shooting black people at random in retaliation for the death of one of their own. The death toll there came to 26. But outside of the big political assassinations, the main deaths we remember are those 4 white kids in Ohio. At first, I thought this was just an artifact of my comfortable white suburban upbringing, but it goes further than that. There's a similar issue with Chicago. Everybody remembers the fact that cops beat up some white kids outside of the Democratic National Convention in August 1968, killing nobody. But the riots that killed 11 predominantly African-American people in Chicago earlier that year are mostly forgotten. This makes the need for a Black Lives Matter movement pretty clear, doesn't it? This fascination with white martyrs has become the official story, far outside of the white suburbs. Last week, I watched an episode of Dave Chappelle's new Netflix comedy show. If I remember it correctly, he too references Kent State rather than Newark or Detroit or Watts. We pretend that we're living through a new 1960s today because we're not remembering the 1960s accurately. We focus on the fact that there are wars in both eras, but we ignore the fact that at the height of the Vietnam War, U.S. soldiers were dying at the rate of an entire war on terror every 6 months or so. This sort of thing is dangerous. We are nowhere near there yet, but if we keep telling ourselves we live in a time of unprecedented crisis, we might actually build one. The only reason Donald Trump was elected is because certain portions of the U.S. electorate convinced themselves that we are living in a time of crisis. We're really not. History is important.
So I think 2017 Rob was wrong. Not about the 1960s. I still think the 1960s were worse than the 2020s. But I think 2017 Rob was wrong to be dismissive of the Trump phenomenon and just how much trouble we're in. The United States is in a lot of trouble. It is a different kind of trouble. It is not just Donald Trump. It is the culmination of a lot of crappy factors. And it's not just Ronald Reagan. It is the Ronald Reagan ideology and approach to things crashing into the television era that made everybody stupider, that made Americans less interested in their freedoms, frankly. And of course, the internet, and now like the, Web 0.80 or 8.0 or whatever, the sort of video nastiness is it's all acceleration, and it's acceleration away from a freer, more independent United States of America. It is this overweening police state that Donald Trump is in the process of building. But Donald Trump would not have been able to be doing all the outrageous things that he's doing, trying to militarily occupy Chicago and Portland and Memphis and Washington, D.C. He wouldn't be able to do those things if it weren't for decades of U.S. presidents, U.S. political parties, both sides of the aisle, creating the infrastructure that he can use in this way. The question now is, are things going to get dramatically worse? And that comes down to, are we going to learn the lessons that Donald Trump is trying so hard to show us, so hard to tell us? Are we going to actually learn? Are we going to finally put it together that actually this elite consensus around pro-war fundamentalism and pro-business fundamentalism is killing us? It is killing us. In 2017, it was easier to envision, Trump being a wake-up call. Now that we're in the second Trump administration, rounding year 10, I don't know how you want to place it, of the Trump era, this isn't just a phase. Like this is an epoch in U.S. history, and it is tremendously damaging, as we're seeing in the news every day. But we're not going to move out of this era until we get serious about finding out what works, finding out what the next paradigm of U.S. politics is going to be. The 100 years ago, in the 1920s and 1930s, a new kind of politics was born in, actually, the state of New York. Governor Al Smith was probably the standard bearer for quite some time, and then that standard was picked up by first governor and then president of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. There was a catastrophic economic depression that catapulted FDR into national power, but New York politics 100 years ago and its reformulation in a more progressive direction, the way that Al Smith and FDR frankly saved capitalism, is something that moved on to the national stage and brought tremendous prosperity to the United States and frankly the world. The FDR era sort of ran out of steam in the 1970s, and we switched gears. Maybe we needed to switch gears for a decade or so. Unfortunately, we've switched gears for like 50 years now, and the returns have gone from diminishing to more and more catastrophic. So I actually see a little hope here. I see there are green shoots all over the country, but again, in New York City, we've got a mayoral candidate, Zoran Mamdani, who has distinguished himself for being against the elite consensus, being against pro-war fundamentalism, being against pro-business fundamentalism in like very serious ways. And I think, is this the path forward? It'd probably take another Great Depression to get us there, but, we might get there. Donald Trump is pushing us there, and frankly, Biden and Obama and Bush were pushing us in that direction as well. So yeah, I don't know. I have got to hope that we can learn something in the United States from the Trump era. We can heed the warning that he's giving us, and we can reverse gears. We can move in a different direction. I've got to hope that, and I still hope that. But I may be losing a little faith. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and I'd like to encourage you to sign up on our Patreon. There are actually 2 patrons-only events available every month. We do a patrons-only newscast, which is sort of like a 2-hour discussion of the relevant news items of the past month as chosen by the patrons. And then there is the Discord chat on our patrons-only Discord server. Did I mention you get access to the patrons-only Discord server if you sign up on Patreon? A bunch of smart folks discussing the events of the world like all the time. I start some of my research there. I hope you will join us there. Thanks so much for your time.